Well, look, I think from the perspective of the Obama administration and from the perspective of many other observers, it's a very, very mixed record. This is a United Nations Secretary General that many world governments, certainly the American government, have found on occasion to be hesitant, diffident, lacking in clarity about some of the public statements that he's made on the many issues that have taken place on his watch since he succeeded Kofi Annan as the head of the United Nations at UN headquarters up there in New York. But to be fair to Ban Ki-moon, he was also, first of all, dealt a whole variety of extraordinarily complex circumstances to try and navigate. And defenders of Ban Ki-moon and defenders of the United Nations system will say, look, the UN is only ever as good as its member states. And for so much of his tenure, for example, Barack Obama here in Washington was barely on speaking terms with Vladimir Putin in Moscow, 2 of the 5 countries that have permanent seats on the UN Security Council. So Ban Ki-moon's defenders say, within the context of what he was dealing with, the kinds of challenges that he was facing were even further complicated by the very, very serious rifts that were occurring between some of the world's major powers.
Now, speaking of those challenges, there have been some major humanitarian disasters that happened while he was at the helm. Let's start with Ebola. I mean, how did he handle the outbreak and how was his response received?
Well, you know, I think Ebola is one of those areas where Ban Ki-moon would say that he showed significant signs of success. And he was aided, of course, in the fact that he was able to marshal the forces of the World Health Organization to try and focus attention on Ebola. And he worked very hard personally to try and focus that attention. And so Ban Ki-moon's defenders would say, look at the situation that exists today. Ebola contained, certainly not the kind of threat to the future of the planet that some at first feared that it might become. And they would argue that that is an area of success for Ban Ki-moon. Critics of Ban Ki-moon would say, even on the issue of Ebola, he never quite found the global voice that the UN Secretary General needs. That's not entirely Ban Ki-moon's fault. English and French are clearly not his first languages. They remain the languages in which international government and diplomacy, for good or for ill, are conducted. But in terms of his own public profile, you know, this is a figure about whom the New York Times could write in 2013 in a withering editorial. He has remained remarkably anonymous despite occupying one of the world's most high-profile jobs. But on that issue of Ebola, clearly the situation far better as Ban Ki-moon leaves the United Nations than it was when he came in.
Now, the migration crisis also worsened under his watch. How did he respond to that?
Well, again, I mean, that's an area where Ban Ki-moon's response is faulted for not having sufficiently taken a lead globally. But he would say, and the people around him would say, what am I supposed to do in an environment in which governments themselves, the UN member states themselves, aren't able to agree any kind of common policy towards this? And, you know, one can see the extraordinary stresses and strains that the refugee crisis has created in Europe, the rise of populist movements in Britain, for example, the UK Independence Party, the rise of the far right once again in France, threats to Angela Merkel's leadership in Germany. Each of those key members of the United Nations, their own governments found themselves being very constrained by the domestic political impacts of the migration crisis. And so for Ban Ki-moon, and indeed for any UN Secretary General, it would have been very difficult under any circumstances to try and put together a coordinated response. Nonetheless, the loss of life that the world has witnessed and continues to witness, particularly in the waters of the Mediterranean, there are people out there that say if the United Nations isn't doing more to try and respond to that and to try and help those people who find themselves in very grave trouble in the waters of the Mediterranean, then what's the world body for?
Yes, and I mean, we also saw during his tenure the rise of ISIS and more coordinated terror attacks. How would you say he fared in responding to those?
Well, he's got a problem in that regard, and he's got the same problem in that regard, frankly, that Kofi Annan faced, and that is that the United Nations has never agreed a definition of the word terrorism. Now, one can argue that this is all semantics, but the semantics at an organization like the United Nations become terribly important, because if there's no agreement on what defines terrorism, it then becomes very difficult for the United Nations to respond to a force that has not any definition or standing within United Nations documents and approaches. Now, he's been through 3 special coordinators to deal with the crisis, for example, in Syria, including his predecessor, Kofi Annan. They have all had limited degrees of success, most recently Staffan de Mistura, of course, trying to put together some sort of ceasefire on the ground in Syria, at least to create humanitarian corridors for aid to go through. But, you know, the fact of the matter is the United Nations claims that it has as a mandate a responsibility to protect. And there are many people around the world who say that, particularly with regard to the fallout from the growth of Islamic State, particularly with regard to the crisis in Syria, and also with regard to the migration crisis, the United Nations really hasn't shown that it can exercise its responsibility to protect people wherever they find themselves facing the kind of difficulties that civilians in those areas are facing.
Now, I suppose the final question will be, how will he be remembered? I mean, do we also have any news on who his possible successor might be in the process going forward?
Well, I think one of the questions is, will he be remembered? I mean, the big question about Ban Ki-moon's legacy is, what can he point to? Now, he will say climate change is one big issue that he can point to where he got things done, especially at the Paris Climate Change Summit. He also points to the work that he's done on the issue of public health, Ebola, that we talked about a little bit earlier. But his broader legacy, I think, is going to be clouded by the fact that even people who have worked very closely with him in governments around the world, and also people who have worked with him at the United Nations, I know people that have worked personally with Ban Ki-moon over the last few years, say they're often disappointed by the way in which they feel that they can prepare him to go into meetings with foreign leaders where they believe that he firmly needs to make a stand and leave his mark. And yet they come out of those meetings feeling that his performance has, more often than not, underwhelmed them. Now, that's coming from people who have worked with him over the last few years, and I think there's no question that it's going to create difficulties for his legacy. We, of course, wait to see who's going to take over from him. The smart money up at the United Nations in New York, and I think to some extent here in Washington, D.C., is the Portuguese candidate, Antonio Guterres. Looks highly likely that he will be coming in after Ban Ki-moon. He certainly is not diffident. He certainly is a much more effective communicator than Ban Ki-moon, but he too will be constrained by the fact that the United Nations is a member organization, and it's only really ever as good as the resolve of its members.